I want to welcome you to today's Yale Career Panel on a candid view of the medical profession. My name is Peter Young. I'm the class of '74 from Brantford College, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to the 25th in what has been a series of panels on careers that started about 5.5 years ago. Now, what was the purpose of this series? Well, first of all, it really tries to focus on providing students and alumni, which is essentially those of you who are registered for this event, with candid views of different professions via panels of practitioners in each field. And the overall concept really has been to try to provide those of you who are students or graduates with sort of a candid view of professions, where there are myths or misunderstandings about where the profession is headed, how you get there, and what kinds of people tend to do well. After all, we all are a product of Netflix and TV and movies, and I guess the myths about being a lawyer or a doctor, or these days with NCIS and Bones, forensic scientists, clearly do not always match what reality is. So over the last 5.5 years, we've given 24 of these. Over 3,200 students and alumni have attended it live, and 3,500 have viewed the recordings of these events. We started recording them after the third one. So we have featured legal 3 times, investment banking 2 times, medical 3 times, consulting 3 times, internet and data services, entrepreneurism, drama and film, education, biomedical, government service, nonprofit, investing, R&D, architecture, investing and finance, real estate, and one panel which compared investing, investment banking, and consulting. The reason why we repeat some of them more than once is because the volume of Yale students going into, say, medical or legal is fairly high. Our next career panel will be on the legal profession, which will be held on November 15th. And we also started last year a series called Yale Career Fireside Chats that featured career issues rather than professions. So we had 2 last year. One was managing major career challenges, which was very popular. And we also had one on serving on boards. The next Yale Career Fireside Chat is going to be on a popular topic, which is the art of networking, and that will be on November 9th. And we have 2 panelists who, I assure you, are excellent networkers. So today, we are here at the panelists here to my left and right. We're here at 230 Park Avenue, and we have some people here who are attending live, and then a large number of you who are participating by streaming video. Before we start, I just want to thank a number of people who really helped to make this program work. We work very closely with AYA, the Alumni Association of Yale, and also the Office of Career Strategies, which, as you know, provides career services for Yale students, but also AAAYA, the Asian American Alumni Association, and also Yale NYC, which is what they call themselves now, which is the Association of Yale Alumni in the New York area. I want to, in particular, thank Trish Takemoto, who is present here with me, and she has been involved with all of these panels over the last 5+ years. And by the way, this is all run by volunteers and at no cost to Yale. So, it's, I think, been a labor of love. So during the Q&A, however, we're gonna have a session. So for maybe around 40 minutes, we'll have a discussion with the panels over certain questions, but then there'll be Q&A, and and we expect to end promptly at 5:30. But the panelists here have agreed to stay for another 30 minutes and talk to the people who are here at 230 Park. If you want to ask questions, there's a chat function at the bottom of your screen, and all you have to do is type in your question, and we'll be able to see it. There's also a raise the hand feature, which apparently no one seems to want to use, which if you use, we'll be able to call on you. So with that, Let me start out. By the way, let me introduce our panelists. To my right, we have Dr. Stephen Dolgen, who is a professor of surgery and pediatrics at the Donald and Barbara Zucker School of Medicine at Hofstra Northwell, and he's chief of pediatric surgery at Lenox Hill, and he is a Yale graduate from 1971. To my far left is Dr. David Nadish, who is a New York. He is an MD. He's at the New York University Langone Medical Center, and he's in the Department of Radiology and Center for Biologic Imaging, and he's also the Yale class of 1971. Did you know each other as classmates? Yes? No?
I tried to get to know him.
You tried to get to know him, but he refused, right?
He was in a much more sophisticated circle.
And the third person here is Stephanie Yang, who is a third-year medical student at the Zucker School of Medicine at Hofstra Northwell and graduated from Barnard in 2013. So we try to get some diversity. It's impossible to have complete diversity, but we do have a diversity by type of medicine, but also by stage of career. So with that, let me get started. And I want each of you really, and maybe we could start just arbitrarily with you, David, is just how did you get in the profession, and then, you know, what's a typical career path for the kind of medicine that you are pursuing?
Well, first of all, thank you for the invitation. I think this is a really exciting opportunity. I did not in advance have access to the questions you're going to ask me, so for better or worse, what you're going to hear is entirely spontaneous. Mm-hmm. How did I get into my present profession? Totally by accident. While I was in college, and between my second and third year, I had set up a very elaborate program of anthropologic study, and the professor a week before I was due to come back and start working on a fairly large and very detailed study told me that he had, in fact, decided to join the Nixon administration. And so I decided, okay, I'll go into medicine. And until then, I had not taken a single medical course. So it was somewhat by accident. And when I did decide to go into medicine, it was because I thought, well, I'll be a psychiatrist. That was my main ambition. At that time, there was a lot about the myth of mental illness and things with R.D. Laing and stuff. So I got to medical school, and I remember just briefly that when I got in, I decided, all right, I really should check this out a little bit. And I went to the Yale Co-op and actually went to the bookstore portion where they were medical, books and things. And the first thing my eye lit on was the kidney. And I was kind of amazed that anyone had written a book about the kidney. So I guess I walked into this somewhat naively. But once I got into medical school, I had a thoroughly good time. And what was truly of greatest importance was the recollection that I really actually enjoyed one thing in particular that I was exposed to, which was looking at pictures. Mm-hmm. And once that happened, once I realized that that to me was a really phenomenally interesting thing, my career choice was set, and I knew exactly what I wanted to do. But it took me until my junior year in medical school to know that.
Okay. Stephanie?
Sure. So I graduated in 2013, and in college, I sort of had this nebulous desire that perhaps I might want to go to medical school. So I did fulfill all the pre-medical requirements, graduated, but I had not taken the exam, the MCAT that I would need to enter medical school. So at that point, I was still unsure, especially as the deadline for applications approached. The realities of what it would take to enter medical school and to complete training sort of became more tangible. And so I took some time off. I took 2 years off. I spent some time teaching. I spent some time traveling and working abroad. And towards the end of that period, I spent some time shadowing a surgeon. And I think having taken some time away from the medical field, coming to realize what I liked and what I didn't like, and then maybe re-entering it with a clearer perspective helped me to realize that this was in fact a decision I wanted to make. So currently I'm in my third year, and as a third year, we spend time rotating in different clerkships. I'm sort of a third of the way through, and I haven't yet decided what I want to do. So right now, just spending time ruling out things more than ruling in.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, well, I got to know Stephanie because she's rotating through clinical.
Is she the one you're the one she's been following around?
Well, I got to play a minor mentoring role, but she's at the stage now in the third year of medical school where you're very immersed in the clinical subjects and you flip from one to another in a way you never get to do again.
Yeah.
And that's a time when you're not expected to know what you want to do. But the whole world of medicine, which is very broad, is open to you.
The idea is to give you exposure to a lot of different things.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So
in
you're not
in my
avoiding the
case,
question about your case now.
So my father was a beloved pediatrician.
Yeah.
And he was a hero.
Mm.
And in my community where I grew up, being his son lent a certain grandeur to my self-image.
Mm-hmm.
And I knew how much it meant to him. So the day that I recovered from my Oedipal complex, I started taking pre-meds,
Mm-hmm.
which was after I graduated.
Mm-hmm.
Now that's become commonplace now. They call it a post-bac program. It's highly organized. Universities make money. It's expensive. And it takes several years. I didn't have a single pre-med. But they concocted a program for me where I took the pre-meds and went on to medical school. And I saved my soul because I thought it would give me a sense of value, a purpose, if I could help people who were suffering.
Mm-hmm.
I felt like if that didn't have meaning, then nothing would have meaning, which is possible, Peter.
Yeah.
It is possible, Peter, that nothing has meaning.
Yeah, that's
I know
true.
for you, that's not the kind of thing you can spend your time thinking about.
I find that interesting because most of the people I know in medicine did not go in because they had any kind of notion that they were doing anything good for humanity. I think most of them went in because they truly thought it would be interesting, that it would be challenging, and that they would actually enjoy the actual process, and not because they had any illusions, particularly that they were going to cure cancer or anything like that.
Well, it's interesting. The medical students today are altruistic. They have altruistic ambitions as a general goal. The big question is, does the system beat it out of them? And do they realize those ambitions?
Right.
But even though you didn't perceive it, today, medical students do want to help people. There are so many fields where you can use your intellect. And the thinking here is I can use my intellect to a practical advantage where I can be of use to somebody else.
Well, let's talk about actually your comment actually is a good segue to this question of where is the profession heading, good and bad? Because quite frankly, what it was like to be a doctor 50 years ago and 30 years ago, 20 years ago, and today, and now 20 years from now is changing very, very rapidly, for better and worse. I mean, there are lots of on both sides of the ledger. So maybe, again, starting with you, David, tell me if, candidly, what do you think is both the profession is heading both good and bad? And by the way, I run an investment bank that's in life sciences and chemicals, so we have to know all the things that are happening, right, to the drug industry and the medical industry that is going on very dramatically, Obamacare and so forth. David?
Well, what's happening that's good is that the field, which has always been a rapidly accelerating and changing field due to the technology, has, if anything, now accelerated. So that the technology and the science behind what a radiologist does has become extraordinarily sophisticated. And where that is going is very likely that within the next 5 to 10 years, the whole interface between computers and imaging with computer assistance and or just assisted imaging per se may very well have, if not an impact on replacing us, certainly augmenting us in a way that no one could ever imagine. Mm-hmm. And it's been like that from the whole course of my career, starting from when ultrasound was first introduced, to CT, which was just coming in when I was starting, to MR, to it's just now taken off, unbelievably complicated. So the good thing about the field is that it is the least static field I can imagine, although I suspect that's true across the board. I suspect in almost every medical profession or subfield, the acceleration of technology's impact has been just extraordinary.
And other professions too.
Yeah, across the board.
Right.
So the good news is that's great if you are someone who feels good about that kind of change, and it's the rate of change that it implies. What's not so good, perhaps, is the fact that it is in fact so heavily weighted towards that increasingly. So that if what you're looking for is, say, the kind of day-to-day interactive where you're taking someone's pulse, or you're actually laying hands on somebody, in the field of radiology, it's become more and more remote. So I spend most of my time now when I'm reading in a room that's completely blackened, filled with screens, 3 blocks from the hospital, where virtually everything is done and communicated by way of what we're doing right now.
Yeah.
And the interface person to person, doctor to doctor, let alone doctor to patient, has become more and more remote. And I think there's every reason to think that will continue. The flip side is that what we do by way of adding value to the whole patient-doctor relationship has just gone extraordinarily helpful because of the technology.
Stephanie, obviously, your perspective is quite different, right? Because you're just in medical school. But on the other hand, I'm sure that you really gave a lot of thought to, what is it like to be a doctor and what it's going to be like when I graduate and so forth.
Right. Yeah. I don't think I can speak to this as well as the two physicians here. It's thinking about, compensation, lifestyle, things like that after I graduate are important things to consider. For me, I would imagine that the reality is different across different specialties. So it's hard especially for me, the fact that I can't envision myself in a particular specialty yet makes it hard to speak about, how I see the future going. All I can say is that despite the changing realities, I would say my intention hasn't changed. So despite, what changes to income might come about or what changes to policy might come about, my reason for practicing medicine hasn't changed.
Well, let me be a little bit devil's advocate, because I know a lot of people who are friends of mine who are doctors. And so this is not my opinion, but they say the good news is, as David said, the advances in technology, the ability to cure, the ability to do things has really advanced dramatically. The flip side, though, is they say, well, the days of the independent country doctor, the doctor of the community and where you did well and you had your own practice and you could do it, are increasingly over. That with all of the rules and regulations and things, it's driving many doctors to just be employees of hospitals, so forth, and the number of independent practices, but also just what they have to do day to day in order to, to make an income. Gone are the days where you could spend an hour with a patient, right? Now it's got to do this. You got a physician assistant. So the feeling is it's just change. For each person, they're saying it can differ whether that's good or bad, right? It all depends on why you want to be a doctor and what kind of lifestyle. Steve?
Wisdom.
The explosion of technology is for sure. David's at the epicenter. How much time you spend with a patient is going to depend very much on what kind of profession you pursue. One of the changes now is it's a team sport. This is a team sport. I would so appreciate being able to access David and review something, and then I got to put it into a context and get 6 other specialists. And as the hospitals are more focused on more complex things, simpler things are managed as outpatients, you really need to have skills that allow you to adapt to these rapid changes and to be a team player.
I would secondly argue that too. I mean, it's become increasingly across fertilization, across multiple fields to actually, and I can't remember the last time we have not had serious cross-cultural, cross-disciplinary, multidisciplinary meetings to solve any real serious problem. That's just part and parcel of where we're not radiology, where all medicine is going.
So interesting for me to have symmetrically across here, somebody who is at the cutting edge of imaging, where the technology is such a huge part of the story, because for a clinician, this has to be put into a context. The technology is advancing so rapidly in imaging that it's outstripping our knowledge of the natural history of what is imaged. If you're my patient, Peter, and we get you ultrasound or a CAT scan, it shows something, I am professionally obligated to advise you what you should do or not do and give you my 2 cents. That's why you contracted me. And I may absolutely not have solid knowledge to make that judgment. So I have to be somebody in my position able to deal with uncertainties because you don't have the scientific, mathematical rules. And there's a whole new field of medicine, I say with tongue in cheek, which is incidental findings and technomaladies. You know, David, where this is extraordinary interface between you and me is sophisticated high-frequency sonography, because the fetuses are developing and people see little cysts in the choroid plexus, you know, the blood vessels on the surface of the brain, and parents are extraordinarily distressed. Had they never had the fetal sonogram by an expert fetal sonographer, they would have been just as well off in that case, because that's probably, for the most part, a quirk of development, actually. A technomalady, a benign technomalady. But what is a doctor going to do? You're not going to ignore something that might require intervention. Leaving it alone could be dangerous. But on the other hand, you've got a secret unearthed about a baby growing in a womb, and you don't want to do something injurious. And so that takes a kind of synthetic ability. So guess what? I have to have a mano a mano trust ad hominem with David or one of his analogs, that I can put this into a context and just how much do we know about this? And then I have to be a little bit of an investigator.
Well, we're very aware of this. And so increasingly, going back to this concept of multidisciplinary, what you're saying is absolutely correct, that our technology has gotten ahead of what we know about the biology.
Yeah.
There's no question about that. And so a good part of my career over the last several years has been trying to address that by coming up with guidelines where it's a multidisciplinary input from physicians, from surgeons, from, well, you're a physician, physicians who are medical and pulmonologists and so forth, to come up with some kind of concept of how to negotiate the fact that we really don't 100% know what the significance of what it is we're seeing, which has then led to a very fundamental change in our field. And I think this is across all medical fields, which is increasingly sophisticated evidence-based criteria for how to make a judgment about whether or not you are or not doing what is appropriate.
We're getting a little bit away about how it's like, we're not talking about what it is to be a doctor. We're talking about how the overall profession is evolving. Right. So we need to get back to a career issues, which really leads to the next question, which is, and I'll have Stephanie answer this, which is, I think many professions have myths versus realities. And I think there are a couple of professions where that's particularly true. I think the medical profession, because it's so popular to have TV shows about doctors and so forth. So from your perspective, now having been in medical school for 3 years, have you, what do you see as some of the things that were myths versus realities from your own exposure, right?
Sure.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So speaking personally, I would say, to put it simply, the hard work. It's something that I sort of naively didn't and couldn't have anticipated, which is the amount of work and time that is required to become a physician. I mean, everyone tells you it's hard work, and you know, but you really don't know until you're in it. So it was just to imagine, especially at this point, the vast amount of information to be learned and the skills to be acquired to be able to call yourself a physician sort of leads to a lot of peripheral things to fall at the wayside. So that could be, for example, family, friends, whether it be interests or even self-care. So it's something that I struggle with, and I think it's a reality of the profession that I hadn't considered before I entered. And especially speaking to the stage of life that I'm in, being in this environment, it sort of feels like at times what I struggle most with, ironically, is not the workload itself or the course load, but just feeling like a lot of my life has stagnated in order to accommodate, to learn this vast amount of information. So
So that's
Very,
that's one thing.
very important because my daughter is 36 years old, and she has an awful lot of friends, and her husband has an awful lot of friends, and they are the best and the brightest. The millennialists are terribly underrated based on my exposure to their friends. And I said to her, I never had so many friends, not even remotely, from every stage of your life. She said, Dad, you had a volume career. What an expression. And that's what you're saying, that it's taking up a lot of time. I think to tell people who are thinking about this that you can be a part-time doctor and have a 9 to 5 and that the training's easy and that it's brief would be ridiculous. If you don't want your career to be a large part of your identity and your self-image as a physician to be big, I think you're probably going to be disappointed. The number of years in medical school, residency, fellowship, working your way up, and the amount of constant ongoing study, if that doesn't fill you with a certain amount of joy, you're misbegotten, right?
You
Yeah,
have to
actually-
acknowledge that mythology that somehow or other, by the time you finish your residency, that's the end of it. That somehow or other you now have achieved, you've arrived, and it's just not true. The ongoing necessity of keeping up in a field, and it doesn't matter which part of the field, just constantly expanding is tremendously demanding, tremendously time-consuming and demanding. But I would agree that that's the thrill, that's the joy of it, is the constant change and reinvigoration that comes from learning something new all the time.
Now, one of the things that I want to raise, which was one of the issues that, because I was pre-med for 2 years and then I switched, and one of the reasons that the doctor who I was following around between my sophomore and junior year was, there were two things. One is how long it took before you became, you were finished and become a regular doctor. But the other was the amount of control you have over your life. And to tell you how long ago, he pulled out his pager, which tells you how long ago it was. And he said, this tells me what to do. And he said the number of plays or concerts that I managed to get through all the way to the end is a small number. And he said, if you have a problem with that, then you shouldn't be a doctor, right? Or a certain type of, the mainstream doctor.
Well, but that's
right?
a really important point, because what we're talking about here is focusing on the high end of clinical practice. But medicine's become this kind of enormous, wide open field where your interest may not actually primarily be delivery of care as we have always defined it. There's the economics of medicine, there's the administration of medicine, there's the statistical background of medicine, the epidemiology. I mean, there seems to be, with a medical degree, an almost endless variety of different types of subfields you can go into, and some are more demanding than others. So if we're defining medicine as solely, the guy with the stethoscope across his neck, that's probably a very narrow way of thinking about it. And I think as we go forward, that kind of imagery is going to become more and more remote. I think more and more we're going to be called on to have multiple skills, not all of which relate to what most people think are medical.
Well, the reality is there's so many different ways to be a doctor. So, I think everyone does.
But this lifestyle of sacrifice that you associate with being the go-to person, the one the clinicians trust, the doctor's doctor. Some of us really put ourselves in harm's way. To get that image and that self-image, that gives you a certain esteem because you're seen as somebody who sacrifices the play and the late dinner and the extra drink and the personal pleasures for helping people who are suffering. And that does have a nobility that persists. And by what I say that persists, I mean that's the old image of the doctor.
Well, when I said that, I didn't say it's good or bad. I'm just saying it's a reality, right? It's just like you want to go into the military. If you're not prepared to go through boot camp, you shouldn't join. It doesn't mean that boot camp is good or bad. It's just part of the job. So when I said that, I didn't mean to say that it was bad. I'm just saying it's part of the job, right?
Yeah.
But
And if you
have
can't,
to emphasize how wide the field really has become, and how
I still
in some
don't think
ways
it's for everybody.
dissociated
Yeah.
with what we have always considered to be the concept of what a doctor is supposed to be.
Yeah.
And I think that continues to evolve. And I think something that was said before is really true. given the rate of change in all of this, there are individuals who are comfortable with that, and there are individuals who are not. I think one of the basic questions you have to ask yourself is, how adaptable are you? How much are you pleased by the whole notion of constantly having to reinvent yourself in order to stay current? There are some people who just flat out are not happy with that, and if that's the case, that may be as compelling a reason not to go into medicine as one that I can think of to go into it.
I really think it's true. I think adaptability and flexibility. Also, if you're a whiner, then you think that things have not been fair to you, and you've gotten yourself a medical degree. Maybe you did a residency in internal medicine at Mass General. You think the whole world should treat you like you're special. You're probably going to go in the wrong field.
But to be honest with you,
you need a hardcore self-image.
There are certain careers as doctor where the lifestyle is different, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we know that, right? So it may be true for most doctors, the hours are long, but you can make some choices, right? Within within the medical profession that contains your. So it's more the issue of do your homework and know where you want to be and then say, are you comfortable with that, right?
I have a really important question for you, which is that we've kind of skirted around the whole question of male versus female in the hierarchy and in the development of being a physician. But you're right now in an interesting place to inform us, certainly to inform me, about what's the status of a woman specifically in terms of trying to make a career decision. Because once upon a time, being a woman would be very limiting. Mm-hmm. There are certain subfields you can go into comfortably and others where it's just clearly the case that you were not welcome. Mm-hmm. I'm curious to know, and I'm sure people who are listening are also curious to know, how much of that is still valid? How much of that are you impacted by, if at all?
Yeah, so I think that's still very pertinent. I mean, I'm considering what I want to do at the moment and thinking realistically, there's qualities of certain specialties that deter me based on lifestyle. Being as a woman, thinking about having children, wanting to have a family, and then trying to weigh that against, for example, a surgical residency that requires upwards of, 80 or more hours a week, or, much more than that. So that's still something that I think about. I think it's certainly possible. There are some of my classmates have children right now and are thinking of having children in the future. But I think very much so there's pressing on my mind is the idea of how to balance career with family.
No easy answer.
Yeah.
But next question is, what are the characteristics of people who tend to do well and are happy in the profession? And the reason why we ask this is that not every profession is suited for everyone. And even if you're good at it, you may be unhappy. I suspect it's hard to be happy if you're not good at it. But every profession is different. So maybe what's your perception? You're starting to see how your classmates are faring. Some are doing better, some are doing worse. You see any patterns?
Yeah. So sort of in this same theme of things, right? Practicing medicine or being able to call yourself a physician takes a lot of time and dedication and training. And so certainly I think the field rewards someone who's patient. I myself grew up in this generation or this era of immediate gratification with, internet fame, social media. So to learn to have that patience and that foresight and wait for whatever professional or personal gratification that comes from practicing medicine takes a little bit of training in itself. So that's something that I think about.
Yeah, so people who accept that or feel they are comfortable with that seem to be at this stage, happier or doing better than others.
Yeah.
Now you have a longer perspective, the two of you, so you've seen lots of people come and go. So,
the successes are upbeat, flexible problem solvers. Mm-hmm. The people who tell you that medicine is not a good profession right now, that it hasn't been good for them. And it would really be worth boring in on that. It's a very important subject. Did they choose the wrong field, or have really terrible things happened to medicine? Here's some bad reasons to go into medicine.
Mhm.
You think you'll make a lot of money.
Mhm.
It is not the case that doctors will be on breadlines, not now and not in the future. And there's nothing inherently wrong with having financial resources. But if your goal is to make a really lot of money and you're going to weigh your satisfaction and your career success based on the more money you make, the happier I am, then you should go into a field where that's more direct and there's no patients involved. That's a wrong reason to go into it. But I'm wrestling with this right now because there are clearly people who are intent on doing the right thing who are unhappy. They're unhappy in the clinical arena with the bureaucracy and the electronic medical records, which are very, very primitive right now, but require attention. And the volume of patients they have to see in the clinical arena. You hear this a lot. And my question for me is, are these people who just don't know how to contend with the stresses? I mean, your job isn't working out, figure out why not, administer it better, get help, change jobs, or are there really inherent problems in how medicine is conducted today? And I think to some degree there are.
I think some of that's age related. So if you look at an overpopulation, let's say over the age of 40 or 50, where you are now having to contend with all of the computer graphics and all the other computer interfaces and the medical electronics, and then you talk to a group of physicians who are in their 30s, and you're talking about two totally different mindsets and totally different skill sets. But let me answer I have a different take on the question you were asking.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a very famous political philosopher who was at, I think it was Oxford named Berlin, who divided the world up into foxes and hedgehogs. And the notion is that there are some people who love to just burrow down into something deeply. And then there are others who are very adept at just crossing over lots of different fields, but not necessarily going into anything in depth. My observation is that the people who tend to be happiest are the ones whose fields adjust and or align with their personalities. So somebody in academics, for example, the people who really are truly driven to get to understand one thing or just a few things and go really into depth tend to be very happy as a general rule. People who are put into that situation who don't have that kind of basic approach to life are very unhappy. And vice versa, people who are really only happy with they're going on a day-to-day basis from looking at a knee to a chest to a brain are very unhappy if they're pigeonholed into an area where they only can function in a particular capacity. So knowing your personality, knowing what it is that makes you excited and happy from the standpoint of your personality is kind of critical. And that may be one way of phrasing personality, but I think that that's a key aspect of all of this.
Yeah, and
Who
actually, normally I start each of these career panels by making the following statement, which now that you remind me, I will now make it, which is these career panels can tell you the perspective from people who are in the profession about what it's like, where is its headed, so forth. But it will not answer the question of who are you as a person. And I would strongly recommend that every one of you, who are listening, that you spend some time really looking at yourself objectively. What makes you happy? What are you really good at or not good at, so forth? Because if you don't have a good sense of that, no amount of information from doctors, who are in it is going to help you make the right decision, right? And if you think you're the next Pavarotti, but you're really not a good singer, right? No amount of career, no amount of information about what it's like to be, a singer is going to help you succeed.
Don't be a pediatrician, pediatric surgeon if you don't have hand-eye coordination. Don't become a radiologist if you can't see anything. I mean, it's just kind of inherent, but you would be amazed how every year in our residency, one or every other year, someone is taken who loves the field but can't see anything. Yeah. That would make them a good radiologist.
But it could be temperament, for example. There's some people who are talented, but they have the wrong temperament. So it's a whole set of things. So the key is to first, before you do anything, is find a way to get an objective understanding of what you're good at and what you really like. I remember talking to one cousin of mine who just went through who went to law school, went to business school, and every time changed careers again. And finally, my uncle said, "Could you please talk to my daughter?" And I asked questions, some basic questions about lifestyle and so forth. And she said, "Well, why is it relevant?" I said, "Well, because if you like being outdoors, you shouldn't be a librarian." And these are the kind of questions you have to ask yourself first before you dive into specific careers.
What can help you tremendously in that regard is to try to find a mentor.
Yeah.
Because if you can hook up with somebody who has that appreciation of you, that you may not have an insight on yourself, but someone who sees you and understands and kind of sees how you would fit in.
And willing to be honest.
And
right?
willing to be honest about it, absolutely.
Yeah.
The person who I trained with told half of my residency, radiology residents, not to go into academics. They didn't have the personality for it. So yeah, absolutely, someone honest. But to find that person also can be hugely helpful in terms of deciding what you
Well, there are some specific things. So you have to like the intellectual activity and the uncertainty and the constant challenges and problem solving. Now that could be that's a necessary but not sufficient, because you also have to like the human interaction. You have to like dealing with all the various genders and ethnicities and ages
Good and bad, right?
and all the genders, good or bad. You have to, and if you want to be in a clinical arena, not necessary to function in a clinical arena, but if you know you want to be a scientist, you could raise a question: why not get a PhD directly? Some people get an MD and a PhD, and they think it gives them a certain ability to go from bench to bedside, But if you know you're not the one to deal with all kinds of people, you're not a people person. Well, but you love science and biology. You could argue just get a PhD. I mean, that's a tricky question. Get an MD knowing I never want to be at a bedside. Yeah,
There are fields in radiology, for example, where you can do that anyway.
Yeah.
Right? I mean,
but there's so much. I mean, you're a lot of what you're talking about is in the groves of academia.
Right.
Because if you're going to be a clinical radiologist, you're going to drive people nuts if you can't. Because I find it so ad hominem dealing with her.
Yes.
Because one radiologist looks at me and says, "This is peritonitis. This has to be operated on," but I know that that's a person who always makes grandiose claims and doesn't mind being wrong. And I mean, I need to communicate with somebody who's clear,
right,
and knows how to talk to me, right?
So that's critical. The other thing is, well, if I'm asked by a resident, should they stay in academics, I say no. Because if they have to ask me whether or not they want to stay in academics, they're not an academician, right? So I mean, it is knowing yourself or having someone help you to recognize who you are. It's kind of a critical part of the process.
Now we're sort of getting. We've been talking about the next question anyway, so I'll officially ask it, which is, I asked a question about what kind of people tend to do well and are happy. Let's think about the other side, which is think about the people who either not done well or are unhappy or both. You already gave some examples, right?
Mm-hmm.
I guess 3 years into medical school, I guess things are starting to sort out too, right? About people. You want to start, and then we go to David, and then to Stephen?
Sure. So I think for all of us, including my classmates, having, as we talked about, a clear sense of self. So the most successful of my classmates did take some time off, and I think that helped to clarify what their intentions were in going to medical school and what they ultimately wanted. A few of my classmates who were struggling a bit more sort of came immediately from college following a preset course, not thinking too well until, reaching a later stage of their medical school education and then coming to realize more of the realities of the situation. So just having a clear intention, knowing yourself and why you started on this path, because I often find myself referring back to that. There are always moments of frustration, moments of not having that clarity, and then you need to go back to your original intention. It's also thinking about, what's your ultimate goal? If you're looking to make a lot of money, I think we mentioned this, but if you're looking to make a large sum of money, there are more direct and much easier ways to do so. So just clarifying your intention before you start.
The business about the gap years is important. That's a change in recent years. More than half of your classmates did not come right out of medical school. That would have been very different for you. And
Although I remember to this day when I got accepted at Yale and getting the letter, it said, you will attend, you won't attend, you will attend in 1 year. You could just check that. And I didn't. And to this day, I regret that I never checked that. I mean, what a great opportunity. Right out the window.
But I think to have gained maturity and more worldly experience before you enter the years of schooling, it's got something to be said for it.
Well, at a minimum, it helps you sort some things out in life, right?
Yeah.
For you,
Yeah.
it helped you sort of appreciate life and what was important to you, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that gave you a better foundation once you started medical school.
Right.
Don't go because someone wants you to go or expects you to go. And that's more commonplace, I think, than we want to acknowledge. Certainly for the money, that's also don't do that. Don't go in if you think that the rationale is that I want the kind of prestige
Right.
that comes from it that would be supportive of my own, sense of self. That's a horrifically bad reason to go into medicine. I think there's a fairly good winnowing out in the process to make sure that people who are really not that interested at heart for going into medicine don't quite get there, only because the threshold is so high. Although I would argue that the threshold is not necessarily placed in the right place. I don't know that doing well in biochemistry necessarily sets you up as a good physician or not.
Yeah.
There are other criteria. But I think the biggest mistake is not to look inside yourself and decide what it is you really want in your life and answer to somebody else.
You do need a certain fire in your belly because the number of prerequisites. You're talking about the hurdles people go through that winnows you out. I mean, there's still about 2 to 3 times as many applicants as there are spaces for medical students in the United States. But the number of hurdles you have to do, if you're chemistry major, inherently it's not complicated. But if you're English major, philosophy major, to take a couple of years of chemistry and biology and physics and the MedCats and all the other specific prerequisites are, you have to have delayed gratification. And if you can't stand those subjects, you may quickly figure out that it's not for you.
But that's actually a bit of a shame because I would like to leave people with the impression that they should not be dissuaded from thinking about medicine if, in fact, they're not chemistry majors or not biochemistry majors, because the profession desperately needs people whose backgrounds are not just strictly, laboratory, pipetting things or whatever, and actually have a sense of humanity. I think most people in the public would argue that, one of the lackings in medicine is that there's not enough humanitarianism in it. And part of that is the kind of
humanitarianism, computer savvy,
all of the above.
Somebody who's very busy being innovative with their computer is going to have opportunities to flourish in our
Now, it looks like we have about 5 questions, but I've got one comment I want to make before we take on some of these questions, and that is, this is a comment I make that's independent of the medical profession. I think for every profession that we have given these career panels on, whether it's architecture or investment banking, so forth, I strongly encourage people, and this is generically true, to get the opinions of people about what the profession might start to look like 20 years from now. Because the reality is your career is not going to be 2 years. It's going to be long. And what's important is that you do some homework so at least you have the opinion of knowledgeable people about what the professions might look like 10 or 15 years or 20 years out. My profession, investment banking, it has changed dramatically in the last 10 to 20 years, and it's changing even more dramatically in the next 10 years. If someone made a decision today to go into investment banking based on what is today, without thinking about how it's changing, that would be a serious mistake. So I make this comment about pretty much every profession because there are very few professions that aren't going through change, in terms of what it's like and the skills. Now let's take, we've got 5 questions here. So I'm going to read them. The first question is, thank you. Okay, so that's a good one. Second is, does the lifestyle of sacrifice follow from necessity or tradition? And would anyone be available to comment on the recent changes in resident duty restrictions? All right, that's a very specific question. Whoever wants to answer that question.
So, the field that is notorious for being brutal in terms of hours, almost as a mark of pride, is general surgery, which I had to do to become a pediatric surgeon. And it is probably the case that when work hour restrictions became federalized in the United States in 2002, it saved general surgery. In 2001 or thereabouts, 30% of university general surgery programs didn't match with American graduates. And guess what? 50% of medical students were at that point women. And it wasn't a profession that looked favorable to women, and it was particularly brutal in terms of lifestyle. So even if you had rational male leaders, a question is, how are you going to mother babies and tread those kind of waters? And when they federalized work hour restrictions, it immediately changed. Whether it's cause and effect, who knows? But 99% of the academic spots. As far as this, I'm not sure what the questioner specifically wants to know about work hour restrictions. We can all have opinions, good and bad. The negative opinion is that people have a shift, SHIFT mentality, and no longer have the profound devotion. But the positive is that exhaustion is a bad thing, and this mark of pride, a rite of passage with endless hours, was absurd.
Now, the second question is ideally suited for you, Stephanie, which is, would anyone be available to comment on the recent changes in resident duty restrictions?
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So yeah, they recently lifted it from, it was a 16-hour ban, and so recently they've allowed for 24-hour call, and so representing my classmates, our perception is we think it's a combination of tradition and necessity. We, especially coming from more senior physicians, there's often a culture and an attitude along the lines of, these are things that we've had to go through, and they're much worse. The culture that we had to endure was much worse than what you have to go through. And so you shouldn't complain about whatever work requirements are put in place at this time. So there's that. There's a little bit of expectation and tradition. And at the same time, it is also, there is the necessity of it, that to be able to, call yourself a physician in a very high stakes field takes a lot of training and a lot of endurance, whether that's physical endurance or mental endurance. And so to be able to work under, even just talking limited to these 24-hour work periods takes time to do. And so I think it's a combination of both.
The next question here is, and I don't know who can answer this, so I'll just read the question. How demanding of a specialty is psychiatry? Does it lend itself to a balanced and happy lifestyle?
Psychiatry is not really what psychiatry was. Talk about a field that's gone through an extraordinary evolution over the last generation or two. Psychiatry, in the old sense of the interaction with patients, has become more of a psychopharmaceutical field, for one thing. And I think that the combination of psychiatry and neurology increasingly has become a standard. So the notion, I think, that people may have of old-fashioned sitting down and doing Freudian kind of interaction
It's changed.
probably has changed a lot, which is not to say that's not feasible, but I think increasingly the rationale for doing more of a combined neurology / psychiatry combination has become more and more the future, I would guess. And to the extent that that's the case, I think it's a very promising field, because to the extent to which pharmaceuticals and interaction with patients starts to improve as pharmaceuticals and the range of pharmaceuticals become available, the ability to actually interact right now with individuals has become phenomenal. And I will tell you right now, if you're interested, as a subset of that, there is a huge interest in opiate.
Which is a big problem.
Big problem, and that there's not enough psychiatrists to deal with that. There's also the whole issue of the veterans returning and all of the kinds of issues that they have, where there's a dire need for people who are interested in that to get involved. So I think actually it's a tremendously promising field, but I think it's also an extraordinarily rapidly evolving field. It won't look the same 5 years from now.
And very much a team sport.
Yeah.
Because you've got psychologists and social workers and
Yes.
all kinds of adjunctive people. Psychiatrist has the one specific thing that they can do that most of the other professionals can't, which is prescribe drugs, which is why you think of them as a pharmacologist to some extent. But
The next question is, let's see. Oh boy, we got questions pouring in here. So just move the question here. So also, what qualities are needed to be an internal medicine physician? And is there room for physician innovator?
Yeah.
And how difficult is it to bring changes? I presumably, if you innovate, how difficult is it?
Well, these rapid changes David's talking about, somebody's driving them. I'm going to say if you've got the drive, no question you can effectuate change. The young Turks in my field, my partners, are changing things weekly, monthly. And they're having fun with it, and they network with each other nationally. So there's a group of bright young pediatric surgeons who are have chat rooms and blogs and videos they're putting on and conferences, and there's a tremendous amount of change. Yes, internal medicine is a default pathway. It's very broad. If you're thinking about Marcus Welby, being the doctor who looks at the knee and the chest, it's one thing, but the internal medicine is the road to cardiology and pulmonary medicine, nephrology, gastroenterology. It's extremely broad.
But to focus on individuals who are interested in actually being internists, that goes back to what I was saying, that's the kind of personality that's going to only do well if they really are multitaskers and they really do have this kind of very broad, not tremendous depth, but very broad approach to being able to handle anything that comes in the door. And again, in terms of the future, there's a desperate need for internists. I mean, what's happening is internists are being generated.
Primary care.
Yeah. And the need for that is just extraordinary, so that the potential for being innovative and actually creating really good opportunities for yourself in internal medicine, I think, are going to continue to be.
But this is a very tricky business for individuals because there is a big emphasis on finding a niche and being the expert of the left tonsil. And whether that is best for an individual or to be a globalist and a generalist who can really work with all kinds of specialists and gain therapeutic alliance with patients. Those are the people who are suffering right now because they don't have time with their patients. And they need time with their patients.
But you're not demeaning the left tonsil.
We haven't really emphasized this, but it's also the case, yes, we shouldn't be choosing to do what we do based on monetary return, but it's also the case that what you're saying has very direct monetary implications.
Oh, yeah.
Because to go into gastroenterology where you can do procedures is a whole different ballgame than being an internist. And unfortunately, that has not been sufficiently recognized. I don't know if that's going to ever be recognized.
Oh, and internists today don't follow their patients in the hospital. Who would think of it? At least in our part of the country, up northeast, urban centers, who would have thought of it? You get a doctor, you know that if I have a heart attack, I'll have my doctor. Not exactly, because your doctor doesn't really get remunerated if they go to the hospital and there are people in the hospital there full time and there's the cardiac ICU.
Hospitalists, the whole concept of a hospital is kind of.
Yeah.
Now, you just talked about urban, so that you must have been reading the next question, which is someone said, we got a huge number of questions here. What are the significant differences, if any, between practicing medicine in a rural versus urban setting, including things like amount of bureaucracy, ability to specialize in a less populated community, et cetera? Now, all three of you are in New York City, so I guess this may or may not be a great question for you, but you may have an opinion, right?
Well, it's very straightforward. If you want to practice in an area where the actual number of physicians per population is huge, then you have to have something to sell. I mean, that's unfortunately the way a lot of medicine is decided here. If you want to be a gastroenterologist and you want to be in New York, that's a problem because there are already too many. So the advantage of being out in the country is that there's less competition for those positions. The downside is that you are removed from some of the more cutting edge opportunities. You're not necessarily going to be working in a cutting edge hospital or environment. You may not have surrounding you people who are, extremely good in what they do, which is something we haven't really talked much about. But this whole thing of having multidisciplinary is to be surrounded by a lot of intellectually driven people that you get to interact with. And you may sacrifice a good part of that if you go to some really remote place. The satisfaction would have to be that you are very directly involved in care.
Yeah.
I don't think our
But-
panel has the skill set to answer this one.
but-
Rural medicine, what are the restrictions on your lifestyle? That's a very good question. How do you function, make a living in rural medicine? And I don't have the answer.
Well,
Yeah.
I can say the following, which is a friend of mine, his wife is a doctor and moved from New York down to a very rural area. And it was not related to the issues that you were talking about. It related to what the nature of the relationship with the patient and the community was. Totally different.
Right.
And just got tired of being in an urban environment, really wanted to have a different relationship with the community and with the patients, and moved to a very, very, rural area, and is very happy. So that there can be other reasons separate from professional skills and so forth, right? Here's an interesting question. How do you see the rise of midwives, i.e. nurses, and natural practice, and physicians' assistants impacting the future of medical practice? So, and I assume that includes the fact that there are more physicians' assistants and so forth used, and they're interacting with patients, et cetera. Anyone would like to comment? Stephanie?
Sure. So I think this ties in directly to was it work hour restrictions. So initially we didn't have as many supporting staff. So that is to say NPs and PAs. And so a lot of the work that's done by these people were carried out by interns and by residents. So just speaking on this, the very fact that we have them now allowed for, a cut down of work hour requirements. Of course, they've fluctuated throughout the years, but a lot of people have said that the introduction of having more NPs and PAs in hospitals has allowed for a decrease in the work hours.
Is it good for the patient?
I would say it is good for the patient because your residents are working less hours. They are less sleep deprived, therefore more focused. Actually, I read a recent article that said that 24 hours of lack of sleep is equivalent to being inebriated. Mm-hmm. So considering that, and then in addition, having more supportive staff, I think is very good for the patient.
It's part of the team sport. Mm-hmm. Nurse practitioners can have very rewarding careers. Physician assistants can have very rewarding careers. And if they know how they fit in and can work well with physicians and vice versa, it can be a very smooth clinical functioning system.
David?
I have no problem with it at all. I think that the more involved we get on every level in terms of the provision of healthcare is a positive. And there's no reason why there should be any kind of negativity or any kind of resistance to increasing that. I think that, as you were both saying, it adds to the quality of the care.
Well, there's good news and bad news. The good news is there are a whole lot more questions. The bad news is that we've run out of time. But I wanted to thank all of you.
Peter, do they have access to our emails, or I don't know if you all want that, but I'm happy to address questions. Because I was noticing a lot of questions.
Yeah, no, there are a lot of questions. Now, some are overlapping, but so forth. But certainly, if you want people to have your email, I can send to the people who registered.
Okay.
I'll leave it up to each panelist to decide. But I want to thank you because this has really been a wonderful conversation, and I think we achieved our goal of having an even-handed, candid discussion. I wish we had more time for all these questions, but we don't want to, go too far over time. But I do want to recommend to everyone that they consider the other two that are coming up. One, the Art of Networking, which is November 9th, which is probably a good skill no matter what profession you're in. And the other is the legal profession, which is going to be on November 15th. One of the questions that was asked was, are these sessions being recorded? The answer is yes. This one will be posted at yalecareerpanels.com along with 24 other recordings. So if you want to hear what other doctors have said over time, over the last 5 years, we have those. Or if you have an ambition to be an architect, there's a recording about
And
architecture.
if you go to YouTube and go to Yale Career Panels, what you
No, you just go, there's a website called yalecareerpanels.com. And if you go there, there's a little thing that says button, and it has all the recordings.
Well, Peter, I just want to say that you've been terrific to do this. I think you've really made a contribution with these panels, and it's been a hoot for me to participate in it.
Well,
Yeah.
it's, well, the
If
key,
you're looking for career advice, I still think you should become a career counselor.
well, thank you for the advice.
Unsolicited.
Thank you much, everyone.